So before we can go ahead and dive into our code for this part, I need to explain something to you about the naming conventions involved. As you might understand, for a city generator, we will have multiple buildings. And in our case, that means we have 10 houses and we have 7 models of high-rise towers. Now, we need to be able to distinguish between these in our code. And for that, they require to be named in a particular way so that we can actually distinguish between them. In my case, I've designed a numbering system that has houses start with number 0 and commercial buildings start with 1. So what I do is, instead of string names, I'm using numbers for these buildings because that will make copy stamping a lot easier. And also, if I have to apply math to these buildings, numbers will work, whereas strings, of course, are then difficult to do. So onwards for that, for the house numbering, that would bring us to a starting number of 0, and house number 1 would in this case be 0001, whereas the second one would start with a 0 and then be house number 2, and so on and so forth. The commercial high-rise buildings consist of 3 parts, a base part, a mid part, and a top part. This is so we can stack them later to different heights. Our naming and numbering convention will have to take this into account. We will have to be able to distinguish between houses and commercial towers. But then for those commercial towers, we have to be able to distinguish between their base, mid, and top sections. We have already decided a commercial building will be numbered starting with a 1 to distinguish it from houses which start with number 0. We can distinguish between sections by having each commercial building number end differently, by saying each base section ends with a 0, each mid section ends with a 1, and each top section ends with a 2. This, for example, gives us building numbering range 1000, 1001, and 1002. So now we can distinguish that they are a commercial tower, starting with number 1, and that they are a top section, for example, seeing a number end with number 2. But which tower is it? It would be likely to have more than 10 different towers on any big project. So we will need double number padding for that, which is where the middle 2 digits come in, numbering 01, 02, 03, until 99 potentially. So we have commercial towers starting with 1, then the next 2 digits tell me which of the commercial towers it is, and the last number tells me whether we have a base, mid, or top section. This is how we get the next building to be numbered 1010, 1011, and 1012. By extension, the next range would be 1020, 1021, and 1022, and so on. Let's go back into Houdini and prepare our node and write the code. So we have a node already that we just created earlier called buildings. There is not much on there aside from the standard stuff. So let's go and edit the parameter interface to create some items we want. We want to have a folder because we're going to create a custom Python interface that we're going to be using. So let's add a folder. By selecting the transform here and adding the folder in there, it's going to dump it underneath. That avoids me from having to find it all the way at the bottom and dragging it up. So I'm going to now drag it up from there. Let's name this folder import buildings, lowercase for the name, and the label can have capital letters. And inside that folder, I want a few parameters. So first I want to add a file path, because this is going to be the file path to the folder containing our buildings. Then a separator. And then underneath the separator, you'll see something familiar, hopefully, a string, which is going to be our Python interpreter, and a button that's going to execute our code in there. So for the path to the buildings, let's literally call it path to buildings, and let's label it the same, only with capitals. Then this is going to be our Python window, so let's name that import code, because it's going to be the code that's going to import the buildings. Set the type to, we'll leave that as a string. We set it to multiline, however, and the language we set to Python. Then here's our button. Let's call it import and label it import, because that makes sense. When you press it, it basically imports the buildings defined in the path to the buildings. Let's set the callback script to Python and write something again familiar, hopefully. who.node.parm. So we're referencing this node, and the parameter we just created is called the import code, and .eval, which is then a function to evaluate what's written inside. And of course our good old execute command. Let's hit apply and accept and test that what we've done actually works. So let's print a test statement, and sure enough, there we have it, test. So that's set up for us. In the next video, we'll start writing the code to import the buildings.